You know, after seeing Rocky Horror Picture Show as many times as I have, I really didn't think it was possible for Janet's character to get any worse. Well, I'm unpleasantly surprised to say that I was wrong. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, this week will be the third and final entry in the Rocky Horror Trilogy series that I've been doing the last few weeks, which, as mentioned in my previous videos, is not technically a trilogy. It's two related films plus one unrelated film, but that one unrelated film has its distribution history very closely tied to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Of course, now that I've actually finally gotten around to seeing the final movie in this series I've been doing, I've come to realize that really none of these movies are truly related, and yet they are at the same time. So, with that in mind, this week we'll be reviewing Shock Treatment from 1981. Now, Shock Treatment is the sequel to Rocky Horror Picture Show. I say sequel in quotes for reasons I'll get into later. But this was a film that was made to be a follow-up to this hugely successful cult film. And considering exactly how successful Rocky Horror was, it's kind of remarkable that the franchise just ended here. Because like I mentioned in my Rocky Horror Picture Show review, the Rocky Horror Picture Show was the third highest grossing film of 1975, right behind One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Jaws. But not only was the Rocky Horror Picture Show immensely successful when it was released, but it maintains an incredibly devoted fan base to this day. And to put it cynically, considering that the movie is basically a genre exploitation film from the 70s that mainly appealed to LGBT sensibilities, it's kind of remarkable that, as a franchise, this intellectual property was not milked to death. I mean, granted, it is true that this was an era where sequelizing and franchising wasn't nearly as pervasive. But generally speaking, if you have a hugely successful movie, you think you would capitalize on it. But no, not only did Shock Treatment take 6 years to come out after the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but it's also a movie that is not really talked about, at least not in the same way as the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Genuinely, ever since I found out about this movie's existence, I've been incredibly fascinated by its standing as a follow-up to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And looking at the reputation that the movie has, it's incredibly mixed. Like, I've talked to a lot of Rocky Horror fans who love this movie and think that it's a great pairing to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but I've also talked to a lot of other fans who don't even bother acknowledging that this movie exists. They just flat out don't care for it. And that's such an interesting dichotomy. And sitting down to finally watch this movie and see what everything is about, I think I understand both perspectives as to why people would both like this movie and intensely dislike it. Of course, considering that this movie is not as widely known as the Rocky Horror Picture Show, you might be asking yourself, exactly what is Shock Treatment about? Well, when Shock Treatment begins, we get introduced to the central setting of the film, a television station called the DTV station, named after the town of Denton. Denton being the fictional town that the Rocky Horror Picture Show takes place in. You actually see a Denton billboard at the beginning of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, as it's branded to be the home of happiness. And interesting trivia, despite the fact that Denton is very clearly named after Denton, Texas, the fictional town in the universe of these movies is actually in Ohio. Which I think is absolutely hilarious, because Ohio is like the most basic place ever, which really suits the satire of this film. But in any case, at the start of the film, we see that the TV station is letting in a live studio audience to sit in at a game show. And two of the audience members are two very familiar characters to this franchise. The two audience members being Brad and Janet Majors, formerly Janet Weiss. Now, Brad and Janet are not only the main characters of Shock Treatment, but they were also the main characters of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. But, interestingly enough, they have been recasted in this film. In the original Rocky Horror Picture Show, Brad and Janet were originally played by Barry Bostwick and Susan Sarandon, respectively. But, for a lot of different reasons that I'll get into later, the two actors were unable to come back for this film, so they were recasted with Cliff DeYoung and Jessica Harper. And interestingly enough, Jessica Harper not only plays the female lead in this movie, but she also played Phoenix, the female lead in Phantom of the Paradise, which is of course the first movie in this trilogy series that I did. And the fact that she has been casted as the female lead in a Rocky Horror follow-up just further hammers home the connections between Phantom of the Paradise and Rocky Horror, which I love. But in any case, Brad and Janet are sitting in on the studio audience of a couples game show called Marriage Maze. And this game show, as well as pretty much every other program on the DTV network, is being sponsored by a fast food mogul named Farley Flavors, who has a much larger role in the film as it continues. In any case, though, Janet is incredibly captivated by this game show, but Brad didn't even want to come to the live audience to begin with. And Brad's reluctance is reinforced by not only the fact that him and Janet are the couple chosen to participate in the game show, but also by the reality that the game show's host, a blind man, blind in quotes, named Bert Schnick, constantly mocks Brad and gaslights Janet into believing that Brad is an emotional cripple. Bert then recommends to Janet that Brad should be sent to Dentonvale, which is the local behavioral hospital. Brad, quite obviously, says that he's going to refuse to go to Dentonvale. But Janet, who has been having marital issues with Brad lately, insists to Brad that he has to go because all he does is embarrass her, and if he doesn't go to Dentonvale, then he'd essentially be embarrassing her in front of the entire town. So, just like that, Brad gets admitted to Dentonvale. And Dentonvale, as a behavioral institution, is very interesting for a lot of reasons. But one of the things that makes it the most interesting is exactly how abnormal the staff are at Dentonvale. Because the two doctors who run the institution are a pair of incestuous siblings named Cosmo and Nation McKinley. Meanwhile, the nurse, Nurse Anselong, seems more like she's a lady of the night as opposed to a lady of health. Of course, the personalities of these characters are heavily influenced by the people playing them, as Cosmo, Nation, and Anselong are played by Richard O'Brien, Patricia Quinn, and Little Nell Campbell, respectively, who obviously also played Riff Raff, Magenta, and Columbia in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And as a side note, as mentioned, Cosmo and Nation are incredibly incestuous, and so are Riff Raff and Magenta in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So, I don't know, I think Richard O'Brien just has an incest fetish. I don't know. He wrote both movies, so I don't know what to tell you. But in any case, Brad is put under lock and key, and while Janet is initially concerned over Brad's well-being, her concern and compassion slowly melts away as she begins to enjoy the newfound independence and freedom that she's been afforded more and more and more. And this newfound empowerment that Janet is enjoying is not only being encouraged by this game show host Bert Schnick, as well as Dr. Cosmo and Dr. Nation. Dr. Nation. That's funny. Didn't realize that. But as we find out, the network sponsor, Farley Flavors, is also making a concerted effort to manipulate Janet into abandoning Brad and embracing her own selfish desires. And in the meantime, while all this is happening, there is a parallel investigation being conducted by Betty Hapschatt and Judge Oliver Wright, who have both become suspicious over the odd interest that DTV has taken in the majors, and they've become convinced that there's some sort of conspiracy surrounding Dentonvale. And also as a side note, the character of Betty has also been recasted from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Her character at the beginning of Rocky Horror was originally played by the actress Hilary LaBeouf, but in this movie she's been recasted for Ruby Wax. Meanwhile, the character of Judge Oliver Wright is played by Charles Gray, who also played the criminologist in the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And taking that into consideration, I am convinced that Judge Oliver Wright and the criminologist are the same character. Like, I know having the same actor casted in a different role in the same franchise doesn't necessarily mean that they're supposed to be the same character. I mean, Kevin Smith has been doing that with his movies his entire career. And it's also the case in this film that Richard O'Brien, Patricia Quinn, and Lil Campbell are all playing different characters as well. But Judge Wright and the criminologist are just too similar personality-wise, so I am convinced that they are supposed to be the same character. That being said, technically speaking, the only character in this movie who was not recasted is Betty's husband, Ralph, who is still played by Jeremy Newson, which is interesting. Anyway, as Betty and Judge Wright conduct their investigation, they both come to the discovery that not only are the McKinleys lying about being doctors, they're actually both actors, but they also discover that Farley Flavors is the long-lost twin brother of Brad Majors. Bum bum bum. And that the whole reason that he's been manipulating Janet to get Brad out of the way and abandon him is because he's always been jealous of his brother and he wants to steal his brother's wife. Which, yes, I know that that is the same story as Hamlin the Viking, and Hamlet from Shakespeare, and The Lion King, and Twitches, and a myriad of other things where a man kills his brother for his brother's wife, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? But in any case, after Betty and Judge Wright make this discovery, they break Brad out of Dentonvale, and the three of them then go on to confront Farley Flavors right before he's able to make his final claim for Janet. Farley obviously denies his relation to Brad, and insists that Janet is his, as she's about to be crowned Miss Mental Health. But without any hesitation, Janet chooses Brad over Farley. And enraged by this outcome, Farley commands the local officer, Vance Parker, to take Janet, Brad, Judge Wright, and Betty and lock them up. And also interesting trivia, Officer Vance Parker is played by the actor Christopher Malcolm, who played Rogue 2 in The Empire Strikes Back. Which, that's funny. Anyway, moving on from that, Farley Flavors has ultimately succeeded at his central goal of taking over Denton, as he's managed to convince everyone in the studio audience to voluntarily admit themselves into Dentonvale. But fortunately, our heroes are able to fool Officer Parker, and they're able to break out of the room that they were locked in. Brad and Janet then kiss and make up, and the two of them, as well as Betty and Judge Wright, then drive off into the sunset in a brand new car. Of course, despite this happy ending for our heroes, the villain has ultimately won, as he's managed to reinforce his stranglehold over this community. And that's how the movie ends. Now, I'll be incredibly frank about this, and this will probably be a hot take, but Shock Treatment is a much better movie than the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Like, everything about this film is just superior in every way. It has a more coherent plot, it's better paced, it's a more emotionally effective film, and frankly speaking, it also has better music. Like, seriously, I would say that every single song in the soundtrack of Shock Treatment is better than any of the songs in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, with maybe the exceptions of Sci-Fi Double Feature, Time Warp, Hot Patootie, and Rose Tint My World. Like, with the exception of those 4 songs, Shock Treatment just has a plain better soundtrack. I mean, seriously, the 2 songs of Denton and Shock Treatment alone are just chef's kiss. They're amazing work. And if you don't believe me about that, Sal Piro, who was the president of the Rocky Horror Fan Club when this movie was made, even acknowledges that he thinks the soundtrack for Shock Treatment is better. And I think the soundtrack being this strong is also heavily supported by the vocal talents of the people in this film. I mean, obviously, Richard O'Brien, Patricia Quinn, and Nell Campbell were all in the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and all 3 of them came from musical theater, so they all know how to sing. But you also have Jessica Harper, who came in to replace Susan Sarandon on this film. And not trying to throw shade at Susan Sarandon, but Jessica Harper just has a stronger voice. I mean, her having a strong voice was literally like a pivotal aspect of the plot in Phantom of the Paradise. And she actually channels the bass of her throat to give the strongest impact to the lyrics that she's singing. The woman is an amazing singer. Of course, then you have Cliff DeYoung, who I think does a spectacular job in this movie, not only singing back and forth with himself, because obviously the characters of Farley and Brad have a song number together at the end of the movie, but he also does an amazing job playing 2 incredibly distinct characters. being Brad and Farley. And he does such a good job playing Brad and Farley separately that I didn't even realize when I was watching the movie that Cliff DeYoung plays both Brad and Farley. And that sounds stupid thinking about it now because they're both clearly the same person. And granted, you can also make the claim that part of the reason why the characters feel distinct is because Brad spends the majority of the film in an asylum? But the way Cliff DeYoung plays both characters is so incredibly distinct. You know, Brad is a more timid, conservative, small-town guy. Meanwhile, Farley is just greedy and confident. Like, he carries himself in a different way. Even the body language between the two characters is different. And also, as a side note, apparently when Cliff DeYoung was trying to distinguish the characters of Brad and Farley, he made Farley more like Jack Nicholson. And you can sort of see that in the way he's dressed and made up. But when I was watching the movie, I just thought to myself, man, this guy looks a lot like Max Headroom. Like, that was the thought I had. I thought that Farley, like, as this fake guy, just looked a lot like Max Headroom. Putting that aside, though, I think Cliff DeYoung should be given credit for the talents that he put into this film. And oddly enough, the twist with the two of them being twins, while a bit contrived and played out, didn't really annoy me the way it normally does. Because typically, I'm not really a fan of the evil twin storyline. I mean, the whole setup of evil twins was the thing I hated most about the new Star Wars show, The Acolyte, which was a show that, for the most part, I actually enjoyed. Like, don't at me on that, but I thought it was genuinely pretty good. But I, like, hated the evil twin storyline between Osha and May. I thought that was just a stupid setup. But in this movie, because it has sort of an elevated, absurdist tone, the evil twin reveal doesn't really feel as ridiculous as it would, because this is already a ridiculous world that we're living in. Of course, that absurdity does bring us to Shock Treatment's greatest strength, being the satire that this film employs. I mean, this movie makes some absolutely scathing social commentary, heavily criticizing the hypocrisy of small-town America, the vapid corruption of the television industry, and the commodification of mental health services in America. And the movie is so deliberately thought out that it does an amazing job blending those three concepts together in a way that makes sense. I mean, from the opening lines of the opening song, Denton, the movie's making a point of criticizing the shallow progressivism of small towns in America who are trying to adopt more inclusive ideas, when in reality, all they're doing is masking all the ugliness that really exists in small town America. And that's further reinforced later in the film when Janet's father has a song all about how he hates Mexicans and gays. Like, this discrimination still exists in these communities, but these small towns are trying to cover that up. And they're trying to cover that up through the representation that TV can offer them. And also, as a side note, the woman that sings the opening number for Denton, the character Neely Pratt, she's played by Betsy Brantley, who was the original stand-in model for Jessica Rabbit in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But moving on from that point, this film shows how television can shape and manipulate the perception of people and areas. And that also plays into the mental health commentary, because as mentioned, Janet at the beginning of this film is manipulated into thinking that Brad is an emotional cripple. And it isn't that hard to convince her of that because she's already unhappy in her marriage. And over the course of the film, Janet herself as a character becomes further and further corrupted by these forces of television to a point where she is now as mentally ill and doped up as they had her believe Brad was. Like, it's also incredibly genius, and there's really not another film out there that employs these ideas in this precise way. Like, there are certainly other movies that talk about the hypocrisy of small-town America, or the corruption of the TV industry, or how terrible the mental health system is in America. I mean, movies like Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, heavily point to how small-town tyrants will often rage against New Age ideas. And there's also movies like Quiz Show, which goes out of its way to tell you how you shouldn't trust everything that you see on TV. And then there's movies like Unsane, which goes out of its way to illustrate to you how mental health institutions will just convince you that you're crazy, that way they can collect money from the insurance companies. Like, it's all just a massive scam. But while all three of these movies cover those topics extensively, there's not really a movie like Shock Treatment that bundles all those ideas together and distributes them in one. Like, it's wholly unique in that sense. And I think that the fact that Shock Treatment is just so thematically rich is what ultimately makes it a superior film to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which at the end of the day is just a film that parodies the cult B-movie monster and sci-fi genre. Now, to be clear, I'm not sitting here saying that satire is inherently superior to parody. There's plenty of great parody films out there like Black Dynamite or like Galaxy Quest, which do an outstanding job poking fun at the genres that they're paying homage to. But with the Rocky Horror Picture Show, while I do love that film, the fact of the matter is that because the film is so incredibly poorly paced, it causes the parody elements to fall flat. And to be fair, you can make the argument that the reason why all the scenes in the Rocky Horror Picture Show are so drawn out is because the movie is poking fun at how drawn out the scenes were in the classic B-movie monster films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. But that doesn't make the parody any more effective or funny. It just makes it boring. Which also happens to be the main reason why audience participation with the Rocky Horror Picture Show started to begin with, but, I already talked about that in my last video. Bottom line, Shock Treatment just does a better job being a satire than Rocky Horror does being a parody. And the fact that all the satire blends together to support the central theme of image that Shock Treatment plays around with only goes to further reinforce that point. The fact that the movie is all about this idea of how we view ourselves versus how other people view us. It's so perfectly executed with this film alongside the satire. Of course, me also going back and forth talking about Shock Treatment's relationship with the Rocky Horror Picture Show isn't exactly fair from either standpoint, because obviously this entire time I've been pointing out how Shock Treatment is a much better movie than Rocky Horror, but the reason why a lot of people don't like this movie is because of its relationship to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Because the fact of the matter is that the Rocky Horror Picture Show was kind of lightning in a bottle. It gave people exactly what they wanted at exactly the right time. It was a trashy genre B-movie that was also a musical that played heavily into queer themes and subject matter. And there was really nothing like that in the mid-70s. Like, that just didn't exist. So when Shock Treatment rolls around 6 years later, and people are told that it is a sequel to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, they're going in expecting the same vibe, and they don't get that. I mean, even the Shock Treatment fan club presidents, Madman Mike and Bill Brennan, acknowledged the fact that this movie's relationship to the Rocky Horror Picture Show actually hurt it in the long run. Because if you play this movie for someone who has either never seen Rocky Horror or isn't aware of this film's connection to Rocky Horror, they'll probably enjoy it. Which plays into sort of the interesting status that this movie holds as a follow-up to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Because, to be perfectly clear here, in a technical sense, Shock Treatment is absolutely a sequel to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It has recurring characters from the previous film, it has a similar tone and aesthetic, which is obviously grounded in the fact that both movies are rock musicals, and it was made by the exact same creative team. However, despite those similarities, and despite the fact that this movie is technically supposed to exist in the same world, it also doesn't align itself with any of the same themes as the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It recasts the central roles as mentioned, and it doesn't even follow the same narrative through line of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It doesn't even reference any of the events of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which kind of lends credence to the theory that the Rocky Horror Picture Show is just a movie that exists within the world of Shock Treatment. Like, that's a popular fan theory. But those elements together make the movie feel incredibly distinct, and also allows the film to stand on its own. I mean, in a lot of ways, you could just consider Shock Treatment more of a spin-off than a sequel, which is why so many people attached to this production don't refer to Shock Treatment as a sequel. What they say is that Shock Treatment isn't a sequel, it's not a prequel, it's an equal to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I don't think is technically true because I think this movie is better than Rocky Horror, but you understand the sentiment, that this is a separate story that plays around with different ideas, and that it just has a little bit of connective tissue between itself and its predecessor. Of course, while I wouldn't personally consider these films equals, something that they do distinctly have in common is the fact that they both are films that were distinctly ahead of their time. I mean, I already talked about how nothing like Rocky Horror really existed in the mid-70s. But with Shock Treatment, if you look at the movie from a purely aesthetic standpoint, the production design, the costumes, even the music, it feels like a movie that is distinctly grounded in the 80s. And you might sit there and say, well, obviously it feels like it's grounded in the 80s. Didn't this movie come out in 1981? Well, yes, but also no. You see, when it comes to the overall artistic and cultural identity of any given decade, that identity doesn't really begin to present itself until about halfway through that decade. I mean, to give a very specific example, there's a movie called The Limey, which was directed by Steven Soderbergh, who, ironically, is actually married to Betsy Brantley, who plays Neely Pritt in this movie. Married to Jessica Rabbit, lucky man. But Steven Soderbergh also directed the George Clooney Ocean's 11 movie. So he's a pretty good filmmaker. But in The Limey, there's a scene where Peter Fonda's character is specifically asked what the 1960s was like. And his response basically amounts to that what people think of when they think about the 60s was really just 1966 to 1967. Just a very small window of time. And that sentiment is true when you look at any decade of entertainment. Now, obviously, I wasn't around in the 80s, but if you watch a lot of the movies that came out in the 80s, the pop culture explosion that was marked by this sort of Rubik's Cube color-coded aesthetic, paired with this clean-cut 1950s nostalgic tone, like, those elements were only present in movies from, 1984 to 1989. And while there were certainly exceptions beforehand, if you look at a lot of the movies that came out in the early 80s, movies like The Road Warrior, or Scarface, or Friday the 13th, all of those movies were still very much grounded in this sort of experimental era of exploitation that was incredibly prevalent in the 1970s. And taking that all into consideration, looking at Shock Treatment, which is a movie that came out in this exploitation era of the early 80s, makes it feel like a more forward-facing film. I would say that a movie like Shock Treatment has more in common with movies like Hairspray or Little Shop of Horrors than it has in common with movies like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory or Grease. It's really interesting because it really should feel like Shock Treatment's a carryover from the 70s, but it doesn't. It feels forward-looking. And I always have a fundamental level of admiration for movies that are ahead of their time. One of my favorite action movies is Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger. Not only is this movie funny, but it's also an incredible satire on the action film genre and how formulaic it was in the 80s and early 90s. And much like Shock Treatment, it was incredibly underappreciated when it came out. Of course, as unappreciated as I feel Shock Treatment is as a film, there are some flaws with it that you have to acknowledge. For instance, and to be fair, this is a personal thing, and not really the fault of the movie, but it is the fact that most of the roles in this movie were recasted from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Like I already mentioned, I think that the recasted actors do an amazing job in this film, and the fact that the roles were recasted does help the film to feel distinct from its predecessor. But I've never really been a fan of recasts. I always just find them incredibly distracting, and unless there's an in-narrative reason for the recast, you're showing a flashback of the characters when they're younger, I just don't care for them. For me, continuity is an incredibly important thing, and even though this movie doesn't necessarily care too much about the continuity of the world that it exists in, there were still several scenes in this movie where I thought to myself, wow, I wonder how this would have been different if Barry Bostwick did it. Or, oh, I wonder if this song would have been different if Susan Sarandon had sung it. And while ultimately I do feel like they got the right people to play these versions of the characters in this film, part of me does still wonder. But of course, like most recasts, the recasts that you see in this movie do have a production reason behind them. You see, in the 6 years following the Rocky Horror Picture Show's release, Susan Sarandon's star had risen dramatically, and when she was asked if she could come back to do this movie, she demanded a $1 million salary. And considering that the budget of this film was only $3.5 million, that large of a salary just really could not have been afforded to her, so she passed on the film. With Barry Bostwick, however, the reason he couldn't do this film is because he was already committed to doing a different TV show that ran concurrently with the film's production. So that's the reported reason why the two of them didn't come back. Of course, mediating circumstances on this film's production also encouraged me to formulate my own theory regarding their inability to return. You see, apparently Shock Treatment was originally supposed to film in America. They were going to film in Texas outside of Dallas. But when they were going to begin shooting the film, a strike actually broke out with the Screen Actors Guild. So that strike forced them to move the production outside of the United States, which is also the reason why there's no exterior shots in Shock Treatment. Everything in the movie is shot inside, which is also an interesting aesthetic choice. That sort of lends itself to the theater musical aesthetic. But while no one really brings this up, I did find this out while I was doing research, that apparently Barry Bostwick and Susan Sarandon are both SAG members. So if they had participated in this film, that would have made them scabs. So even though that's not cited as a reason for why they turned this film down, I have to believe that that played some sort of factor in their inability to return to these roles. Just a theory on my part though, don't really have any evidence to back that up, but it just seems like a massive coincidence that those two actors are SAG members, meanwhile Cliff DeYoung and Jessica Harper were not at the time. But, of course, that's a tangent. Bottom line, I'm not a fan of recasts. It does somewhat work in this film, but it's still something that kind of bothers me. That's not a big deal, though. A bigger issue with the movie is the fact that Janet in this film is so distinctly unlikable. Now, to be clear, it is not inherently a problem for a character to be unlikable at the beginning of a story. In fact, you probably actually want them to be unlikable at the beginning of the story, because that allows you as the writer to take the character into a direction that is better. You know, it's called a character arc. And there's plenty of great pieces of media I've seen where the character starts off fundamentally as unlikable, but they slowly transition to be a more sympathetic character over the course of the narrative. I think one of the best examples of this in recent memory would be Season 1 of The Legend of Korra, which is obviously the sequel series to Avatar The Last Airbender. In the first season of this show, Korra is basically a tsundere character. She's incredibly abrasive, aggressive, unlikable, arrogant. Like, she's not a likable character, and that is by design. Her flaw is the fact that she thinks that she knows everything because the three elements of water, earth, and fire came to her at a very young age. But she's struggling to learn the element of air. And it's only through her struggles in the first season of this show that she's actually finally able to learn humility and open herself up to learning airbending. It's an amazing character arc that is then undone in Season 2, but that's why I only own Season 1. But still, it is not inherently a problem for a character to be unlikable at the start of the story. But with shock treatment, not only does Janet start off as unlikable, sending her husband to an asylum, but she then goes on throughout the course of the second act, embracing every single selfish desire that she has. And yes, she is manipulated to do these things, but as mentioned, she was already having marital issues with Brad, and she fundamentally enjoys this newfound freedom that she has discovered. Like, her character basically goes from bad to worse over the course of the narrative, and it makes her borderline irredeemable. I mean, there's even a scene halfway through the film, it's right before the song Shock Treatment starts, where she goes in to see Brad as he's sitting in a wheelchair, in a cage with his mouth gagged, and she just goes in to say,
"Hi, Brad. I've just come to tell you how fabulous I am."
Like, it's insane. And by the end of the movie, Brad and Janet just kiss and make up, when Janet should be on her knees begging Brad to forgive her. Like, there's really no justification for what Janet does to Brad in this story. Brad is not a bad guy. Like, he doesn't abuse substances, he's not a wife beater, he doesn't have a gambling problem. He's just kinda boring. And Janet's become fed up with her domestic life. And instead of going to couples counseling with Brad, or if it was really that severe, opting into trial separation and then no-fault divorce, which was legal at the time, she instead admits him into an asylum so she can live her best life. It's just so unbelievably selfish of her. And while technically her character decisions do tie into the central theme of image and how you view yourself versus how you want other people to view you, it also feels like the underlying character conflict that Brad and Janet were experiencing isn't really resolved. Because they're a young-ish couple, assuming that this film does follow the timeline of Rocky Horror. They've only been married for like 5 or 6 years. So there's obviously issues that they should deal with, especially after this experience. But the movie doesn't really address them. And to be fair, Rocky Horror Picture Show doesn't really address the fact that Brad and Janet also cheated on each other with Frank-N-Furter. But it just feels like there's an element of the conflict there that isn't really resolved in this story. And also, in addition to that, there's sort of a weird thematic underpinning behind Janet's decisions in this movie and her arc, and I don't know if they're intentional. I mean, they're probably not. But the fact that Janet embraces independence and liberation and female empowerment, only for it to be revealed that all of those desires that she had were being manipulated by a wealthy fast food mogul who was controlling TV. It makes it feel like the movie's almost like a criticism of second-wave feminism. Like, it almost feels like the movie is making the argument that social causes like feminism are merely a product of neoliberal economics, and how even things like liberation and empowerment are just products to be bought and sold. And I don't think that's intentional, but nevertheless, it's kind of an interesting element that exists in this movie. But at the same time, even though the movie directly highlights exactly how selfish Janet's behavior is in this film, it doesn't really go out of its way to punish her for that behavior, which makes the narrative feel a bit confused in a way that it shouldn't. You know, it's a sort of a similar issue to Greta Gerwig's Barbie, which came out a couple years ago, where it felt like the movie didn't know if it wanted to empower women or critique the feminist tendencies of modern women. Like, that was something that movie was very confused about, narratively and thematically, and it feels like Shock Treatment has a similar issue, but like I said, with Shock Treatment, I don't think any of that is intentional. I think it's just a matter of the way the film was written and how it presents itself. But yeah, regardless of my criticisms, I genuinely like Shock Treatment. I think that this movie is not only better than the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but I think that this is a movie that can distinctly stand on its own. It is a film that does have a lot of things to say, and says those things mostly well, and it's clearly a film that has a lot of thought put into it. Like, I didn't even mention all the visual cues that exist in this movie. Like how the Farley Flavors logo is very clearly meant to be a reference to a swastika, because Farley is like a wannabe dictator over Denton, or the fact that you see a picture of Sigmund Freud sitting on a nightstand in this movie, which follows a night of sex that Dr. Cosmo and Dr. Nation had with each other, which clearly plays into the incestuous element that exists in these movies. Or the fact that this film, much like Rocky Horror, pays homage to the painting American Gothic by the artist Grant Wood. Or the fact that the character of Ralph cheated on his wife with a character named Macy Struthers, who I think is supposed to be a reference to Sally Struthers, and how that's supposed to overall play into the commentary of TV corruption. Or the fact that the live studio audience literally sleeps in the studio because they've just devoted themselves to television this much that their lives depend on it. But bottom line, Shock Treatment is a great movie, and if you've never seen it, I would sincerely recommend it. Just do your best not to compare it to Rocky Horror too much, otherwise you might end up enjoying the movie more like I did. But in any case, that was my review of Shock Treatment. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. If you have any ideas for lesser-known film trilogies that you would like me to cover in the future, please let me know, as I'm always looking for new obscure content to cover, and I will see you later.